So another avenue of research that's been looked at recently is what's called authentic leadership. So it's part of a crossover model from leader-follower theory, and it starts talking about the job satisfaction of leaders and how it influences followers. And in this particular scenario, it talks about work-life balance and how the work-life balance of a leader potentially influences the work-life balance of the followers. So one of the premises of this theory is conservation of resources theory, which says if I have something, I'm going to want to keep it and do anything I can to keep it. So I think the quote is to obtain, retain, or protect resources. And the perception of stress that comes from work is going to influence how a leader acts and how he's going to potentially influence his followers. So we've talked about how one of the things that this research has done has provided some support that modeling behavior by a supervisor is an antecedent to positive work-life experiences for a leader. And this particular research about authentic leadership builds on this idea of conservation of resources and how it applies to leadership in the workplace and potentially at home, and how followers follow their leaders' modeling as far as their job satisfaction and their work-life balance. One of the things with this authentic leadership concept is it has its roots in positive psychology and the idea of positive growth and self-fulfillment. So the researchers here were able to find out that stronger leadership constructs were having more positive effects. So they believe that this authentic leadership can foster positive self-development and development in the followers of these leaders. And there's now one of the things that's interesting about this is that, again, this is research that's fairly new. Most of the research that we're reviewing is actually fairly new. It diverts from traditional research in this domain, but it's bringing in new concepts and some of the contemporary premises and constructs that we're starting to see in counseling and psychology. So again, we're looking at this conservation of resource theory, and they're protecting the work-life balance of leaders, which is then influencing the followers. And that work-life balance, these positive elements of leaders, is acting as a buffer against potential negative effects of organizational stressors. One of the things that they found in this particular research. And the capacity to be self-reflective is something that's been shown to be a positive model for followers and have overall positive effects. And this authentic leadership talks about how open and transparent leaders are trusted by their followers, and that's one of the reasons why the followers have overall more positive experiences in their workplace with these kinds of leadership. So one of the premises of this is that they can affect their followers in 4 different ways. One of them is a direct effect through the leadership that just increases job satisfaction, an indirect effect through leaders' work-life balance, and an indirect effect through the followers' work-life balance, and an indirect effect through the leader's work-life balance. So they're trying to evaluate how these things, and they found that leaders and workers' work-life balance was significantly correlated with each other. So a leader who had positive work-life balance generally had followers, but it didn't necessarily mean that because of they weren't able to establish a link to causation to those. Currently, this authentic leadership, we're still asking questions about this particular research. Is it the case that we have more authentic leaders in organizations that promote wellness and self-reflection, and therefore they're also recruiting followers that are going to do the same thing? So I think that's an interesting research question that they should follow up on, and that should be something to be looking at in future research. Another thing that I was looking at was something called the Millennial Scale. This is a new scale directly targeted at millennial women, and they wanted to create a valid and reliable scale directed at that particular cohort and their work-life balance, their attitudes towards work-life balance. They had about 48 items, they had about 48 items that went across the spectrum, and they have a significant amount of those items not loaded. So one of the things that they're planning on doing in the future is to revise it, and they've done that, but their findings were still the same. So what they were able to find was that many millennial women were looking at defining motherhood and work-life balance and the influence of colleges and organizations. And this is simply developing a scale towards further research. That's all that is. They were able to successfully develop a scale. Many of the questions loaded correctly, but again, about 60% of them were ineffective. So they had to delete them and revise the scale, and we're waiting for further study on those. One of the other research or theoretical constructs that I was looking at that I thought that's going to be a more complete explanation of how people look at some of the work-life balance constructs are a group of authors who propose that everybody looks at work-life balances in 3 different ideologies. One of them, the first ideology, is a fixed versus expandable pie option. So what that says is essentially that people believe that they have a fixed amount of resources that are going to be taxed if you go towards work or life, and that those are going to inevitably have negative consequences. The second one is segmentation versus integration. So the premise of that ideology is, how much can you separate life from your work? And what does that look like? Versus on the other side of that spectrum, do you intertwine your work and life? And again, all of these things are on a continuum. Some people believe that you cannot separate your work and life and they're going to be intertwined, and then other people are capable of completely separating them. And then the third ideology is they're competing at the work versus life, and you have to choose between work or life. You're going to create these resources and they're all going to go this way, or you're going to put all these resources into your life and you're going to miss out on work. One of the influencing things in this construct is the concept of primes. So as you develop over time, different primes are going to push you towards different ideologies more strongly. And they have these 4 levels of primes. So you get primed at 4 levels in your life: family, organization, community, and society. And in each one of them is going to prime you in different ways. And depending on the primes, that's going to help determine which way you end up going. Generally, one of the things with this research is it goes against some of the historical perspective in decision making, and says that it's not always necessarily situational. If you have these primes that you may not have noticed early on, they may positively or negatively affect how you work towards these goals. So again, the fixed versus the expandable pi work and life are kind of competing against each other. Like it's either one or the other, and one of them has to be bigger than the other, and there's only so much, right? And the work versus life, it's kind of which one's more important, right? So we have priorities. So they seem kind of the same, but they're really not. And one of the things, the other things in this particular construct is the primes, for them to be salient, they have to be in certain contexts. And everybody's going to hold all three of these. So whether you hold one or the other orientations isn't actually the question. It's how much do you hold each one. So under this theory, if you have chronic exposure to certain primes, then you're more likely to choose a different one. So they're saying that some chronic primes will influence the extent to which individuals hold the pi work prime.